Slightly cropped. Got it. Everybody has to say got it, right? No, not really. Okay, Michael Kauffmann is the co-editor of an amazing new book called The Klamath Mountains, A Natural History, which I'm working my way through with colored Post-its and notes to myself and much enthusiasm. It's wonderful. I'm so glad. I wish every place had this, this kind of book. And he's written or co-written, and this book had a lot of maybe 30 other co-authors. It's really just a wonderful compilation. We're so fortunate to have access to it. But he's written another, one of my favorite ones is Conifer Country, which also talks about our conifer diversity and gives you guided walks where you can go and see lots of conifers if you're interested. So explore those books in the back afterwards, buy lots and pay for the gas. Something is funny here about our view, but let's see. So the Klamath Mountains contains some of the most exceptional temperate plant communities in the world. Within its geographic boundaries, over 3,500 taxa, species, subspecies, and varieties of vascular plants occur, including 35 conifer species and 20 species of oak. Michael will provide, so he's going to be talking about the vegetation communities, I'm not sure why that's cropped, in the Klamath Mountains. So it's going to have kind of a plant focus of some of the things that you find in that book, which covers a lot. So now we'll have just a moment while we switch presentations here. And if you want to, I would say, put this.
All right. Well, thanks for everybody for coming out in person and for zooming in. I am going to take us on a journey across the Klamath Mountains. It's my favorite place on the planet, and I'm going to tell you a bit of the story behind the book as well. So, let's see here, the slide advancer. Give it a second. Oh, on the slide. That's not why I do that. How did you do it? You just hit this? Okay, I'll just use that. Okay. All right, so real quick, just about myself. I'm a kindergarten through college educator. That work now in California? Okay. All right. Talked about conifer country. I started Backcountry Press with that book in 2012. I'm also the founder of the Bigfoot Trail Alliance, which I'm part of this trip is for me to go work on the Bigfoot Trail in Hayfork with some high school kids this weekend. So that's going to round out the trip with my son here. I've worked with the California Vegetation Committee, and I've also been the editor of Fremontia, which is now called Artemisia. And then we started this book seriously in 2016, but I really started to plan it after I finished Conifer Country, and then I've been the author of or co-author of a couple of other books. So that all being said, I think this is the ultimate project. I don't think I'll ever do anything much better than this as far as creating books, and it's a true love story to the Klamath Mountains. So I think it's important to set the tone here that the Klamath Mountains are a gift, and I think most people are here because they have some connection to the Klamath Mountains. Obviously, where you all live right here, we're right on the edge of the Klamath. The Cascades have sort of flowed over the Klamath, but we're really at that northeastern edge of the range. And we're here because we love the place. But I think there's a couple of assumptions to understand in natural history, and I'm going to tell you what a natural history is in a second. But we can't forget the miraculous existence of the earth. It is a gift and not a problem. And it's our job as naturalists and lovers of the natural world to remind others, and again, I think ourselves about this, because loving the earth is as important as grieving for it. And sometimes I find myself going down that rabbit hole. It's been a nice cleansing winter. All this precipitation has done some really good for my soul, but I think we just need to remember those couple of points there. But discussing love is not something that we often do in science. I'm unaccustomed to it. But I would argue that it's really the only way to move sustainably with stewardship to create this connection with the planet again. So what fosters passion or love for the natural world? My argument is natural history. What is natural history? Well, in natural history, according to Tom Fleischner, who's one of the creators of the Natural History Institute, It's the practice of intentional, focused attentiveness, receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. And how do you tell a natural history? My argument is you tell it through stories. We have a collection of stories I was mentioning before the talk that we organized this book where you could pick it up, you could read one page, or that's okay. Yeah, we're getting. Okay.
Let's see. Let's just. Nope, it's not.
Speak loud. Test. Okay. Okay. Let's just put up with it. Yeah. So, I've organized this book in a way that it has a story might be on a page, a story might be on 2 pages, it might be through the whole chapter. But we're a storytelling species, and I believe that the stories of the Klamath Mountains are the way towards better stewardship for this amazing place. So we organized it, like was mentioned earlier, with in 14 chapters with 34 authors, and I'm not going to dwell on that page, but this is weird. I don't know what happened. The fonts have all changed on my PowerPoint, but anyway, this is my argument is also that the natural history is born out of a definable landscape, and that definable landscape is right here in the picture of the natural history that we drew for the Klamath Mountains. And it's a complex range. There's lots of sub-ranges. Everyone in Oregon knows the Klamath Mountains is the Siskiyous, but when you get into California, things get a little even more complex with the Trinity Alps, the Salmon Mountains, the Trinities, the Scots, all the way down to the Yola Bullies. But I love this quote by Bubba Seuss, who lives in Mount Shasta. It says, "So overlooked are some of these mountain areas that they have escaped appellation and remain anonymous in the truest sense of the word." So here's the Klamath Mountain geomorphic province with roads through it. You can see, obviously you've probably driven 199 if you live in this area, but there's not too many roads that cut through the range. So it's a little known range in that respect. And often the shoulders of the canyons are so high and so tall that as you drive through on 96 or 299, you don't really get a sense of what is up in the high country beyond the river canyons. So this is a remote place. That's the point of this slide. Now, what builds the Klamath Mountains and the story that I'm going to tell you tonight about the vegetation communities, it starts with geology, and the geology is very complex, and it took, I think, 60 pages in the book to tell the story with justice. But you'll notice some patterns here, and that first pattern I notice is that's this sort of arcing directionality of the accretionary events that have occurred here. This is our simplified on the left, the more complex and thorough geological map on the right. But how did this arcing occur? Well, through island arc terrain accretions. And what has happened over deep time is things formed, these accretionary events, metamorphism formed off the coast of the ocean. They slowly drifted on the Pacific plate towards the North American plate and became accreted onto the continent. And we're most familiar with these accretionary events when we walk into a serpentine outcrop, but there's other examples of gabbros that might be a little bit more subtle and other things as well. So that's one piece of the story. We also have this amazing complex climate regime where we are at the southern end of the Pacific Northwest rainforest. My argument is it actually reaches towards Ferndale, just south of Eureka, based on some conifer species whose southern range extensions down there. But we also have the snow forest and these lines in the center of the Klamath Mountains, particularly in California and along the Siskiyou Crest. Those are the snow forests, so those are above 5,000 feet. So we have this dichotomy from north to south, from east to west, but also an elevational gradient. And the orographic effect, that was a picture of Kalmiopsis leachiana and the Kalmiopsis wilderness next to that climate graph. And then the rivers. You can't talk about the Klamath Mountains without the rivers. We have 3 rivers that actually create water gaps through the Klamath Mountains. So this means the river flows through the mountain range. So this happens because the mountains rise and the rivers continue to flow. So the Rogue flows through the Klamath River obviously flows through the Klamath, but also the Pitt and McLeod that form the headwaters of the Sacramento flow through the Klamath Mountains. And then we have several rivers whose origins are strictly in the Klamath, like the Chetco, the Smith, and the Trinity, which flows to the Klamath. And then we are all familiar with the complex fire regimes as well. And all these factors together drive the biodiversity of the Klamath Mountains, coupled with the imprint and impact of the First Peoples and the impacts they've had for millennia on the region. And I think this is a striking graph here on the right that shows the end of that regular fire regime that started around 1900, and the fire intervals just were eliminated with colonization. But thankfully, there's thoughtful people on the ground who are now listening to those voices of the first people again, and we're putting fire back where it's supposed to be, driving the biodiversity and the health of the mountain range. So all of these things, all of these abiotic factors drive the biotic factors, and plants are the drivers of the ecosystems within the Klamath Mountains. And tonight we're going to focus on those plants, but I have to show this one slide about the animals within the Klamath Mountains, and specifically here the amphibians. We have 7 endemic or near endemic salamanders as well in the Klamath Mountains. So this story of biodiversity is not just the plants. We're going to focus on the plants here tonight, obviously, but what an amazing story Justin Garwood has told with the first time, really, the amphibian, fish, reptile, mammal diversity as well, all of that driven by the plant communities. All right, so animals for another time, but the plant communities, I had help on this chapter. Julie Evans co-authored the Manual of California Vegetation with Sawyer. Julie Kierstead lives in Nashville now, but she is one of the most amazing botanists I know. Michael Murray did meadow research as a Cal Poly student and under John Sawyer. So all of these folks helped me with this chapter. I just want to acknowledge them. So when we talk about vegetation patterns, there's a lot of ways to think about vegetation. And it's complex, right? And I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but the California Native Plant Society, this is sort of their definition of how we look at vegetation patterns across the state. But each of these patterns is composed of an assemblage of species with a characteristic appearance based on the size and the shape and the spacing of plants. So it usually has to do with the larger, more charismatic things like, the conifers. And that's what really, for me, was the seed to understanding the Klamath Mountains. But these patterns often repeat themselves, but they've changed over time. And this is a little snapshot from our paleoclimate chapter, where we look at some of the data, say Christy Briles generated by digging down and coring out lakes, and then looking at the pollen that was there 10,000 years ago. But these patterns have been changing and will continue to change over long periods of time. And what we see now is just a blink in what has happened in the past and what will happen in the future. But if we talk about these vegetation patterns, we can talk about an alliance. And in California, this data is there, so that's why I'm using it. I'm not biased against Oregon, but there's 461 alliances in California across the whole state. And this changes again, so there's plus or minus 15. New things are being defined. If we move into the Northwest California, there's 261 of these alliances. And if we zoom in specifically in the Klamath Mountains, there are 136 vegetation alliances. So that's pretty impressive, right? Based on basically this small fraction of the state of California has about 25% of the vegetation alliances represented here. So diversity. One example of this, and this is one that I'm using because I got to map Abies amabilis Pacific silver fir in California. But this is how California Native Plant Society represents it on their website. So just a quick picture of that. But herein we're going to look at these plant communities on the Klamath Mountains, and we didn't focus on 136, right? We had to distill this down. So we distilled it down to 10. And I'm going to start with the coastal lowland forest. So I talked about the rainforest of the Pacific Northwest. This is really the extension of that into California, into the Smith River country, and a little bit further south into the upper Trinity River of Humboldt County. But what are some charismatic plants? Well, we have the southern range extension of western red cedar, Kellogg's lilies. Here's a picture of the Smith River country with that two-tiered canopy with the high Douglas firs and Port Orford cedars and the lower second understory of tan oak and canyon oak. So just spectacular patterns in my opinion. So this is a coastal lowland forest pattern. This is on the Chetco River, where we have the white alder that sees the disturbance and outcompetes the conifers right along the river's edge. This is a western hemlock forest. It looks to me like it could be a redwood forest, but this is from the coastal, again near the Chetco River. But understory is sword fern. No redwoods because redwoods drop out in just north of the Chetco, but still a spectacular lowland forest pattern, coastal lowland forest pattern. And I've included some range maps here for interesting species. This is the Kellogg's lily. I live right here in the kind of the heart of the Kellogg's lily range. It's every July 1st, I get very excited when these start to bloom right along the road. I've even transferred them into my driveway and they are popping up in my yard, which is really exciting. But I just love this plant of the coastal lowland forest. Mahogany fawn lily, very similar pattern and distribution, get a little bit further south into Sonoma County. And I just really want to flash through some of these beautiful pictures. I'm not going to tell stories, in-depth stories of all these. This was a real eye-opener for me. The first time I went into the Kalmiopsis was to see the Oregon bleeding heart, the white version of our Dicentra formosa that I'm used to in California. And I have to mention the conifers, Port Orford cedar. Look at this spectacular range where all the way up from Coos Bay down to Humboldt County and Horse Mountain at the southern range extension. But look at this cool pocket out in the Scott Mountains at the headwaters of the Sacramento River. This climate obviously mimics this climate here. So they've been able to hold out over, since the end of the Pleistocene and survive in this wet pocket. And it's been hypothesized that wet storms move up and kind of stall out around Mount Shasta and provide that extra moisture coming in from the south. And that's why those trees are still there. All right, the interior lowland forest. So as we move away from the coast and start to go up some of those rivers, these are some more of the patterns that we start to see. Things are drying out a little bit. And with that drying out, we get exposed to things like Pinus sabiniana, the ghost pine, oak woodlands as well, which I'll touch on in a second, and of course poison oak. There's a lot of it in this picture. You can't quite see it. Here's a picture from one of the campgrounds along 299 where you're peering through the big leaf maple and white alders again toward the Trinity River. This is near Burnt Ranch. Spectacular spot here near Soames Bar on the Klamath River. The forest here include Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, canyon live oak, among others. And then as you get even further inland, and this is an area that I am very much not an expert on in the Klamath Mountains, but black oak, ghost pine, and the limestone outcrops are above Shasta Lake. This is a picture from Julie Kierstead. But look at these cool patterns with the black oaks decorating around the limestone, and there's all sorts of endemism and new species being described from these areas right now. One of the first really limestone specialists that was discovered, I think this was the late 80s or early 90s, was the Shasta snow wreath, seen along 299 there in the limestone of the Klamath. And the umbrella plant, this is our super charismatic. I grabbed some pictures when it extends into Oregon from the Oregon Flora Project as well. But who doesn't like to hide under one of these in the summer while they're swimming to keep the sun out of their eyes? I think it's just a spectacular place to swim under. It looks like a tropical species that we have here in the Klamath. This is another one that's pretty darn common, but I just, when the modesty starts to bloom, I feel like spring's finally hitting. I have still barely seen it blooming yet. I swear spring is going to come, but modesty is another nice interior lowland forest. And then you can't talk about interior lowland forest. You can't talk about any forest of the Klamath Mountains for that matter without talking about Douglas fir, probably the most ubiquitous conifer grows in the coastal dunes, which aren't in the Klamath, but from my realm all the way up into almost 7,500 feet in across the Klamath. All right, the oak woodlands. So this was the big learning curve for me as I dove into this book project. I understood that we had a lot of oak diversity, but I didn't appreciate many aspects of the oak woodlands. So what do I mean? Well, these patterns, this is an Oregon white community. These are often pure stands along river benches. This could be from the Rogue to the Illinois to the Klamath to the Trinity Alps. But they are often on these benches with thin soils above riparian corridors. And I think it's important to remember, and I'll go back to this, I think it's important to remember that almost every one of these sites, if not every one of these sites along the river benches, were village sites for the first peoples. And they were also the drivers of diversity in these places. So there's often, in addition to the oak woodlands, there's geophytes that were a food source, on and on and on. There's many other factors that go into understanding an oak woodland beyond just pulling off at what's now maybe a campground or a picnic area as we travel through the Klamath Mountains. The oak woodland patterns continue. This is from Whiskeytown. These are the blue oaks. The blue oaks reach their northern range extension in the Klamath Mountains, adjacent to this classic chaparral that's found, just into Oregon, but also south throughout California. This whole hill slope burned in the Carr fire. I need to retake this picture. I think that would be kind of interesting. Here's another picture from near Whiskeytown where we have canyon oak associating with black oak, Quercus callagii. Looks a little too thick, might need to be thinned with some fire, but regardless. And actually you can see the Pinus sabiniana up on the ridgeline. And then canyon oaks, they're often on these steep scree slopes above the rivers, sometimes north facing, sometimes otherwise. And they reach spectacular size within the Klamath Mountains. Here's my son enjoying what I think is probably the largest one in the world. I just haven't measured it yet. And then chaparral, this is like the classic California story, right? But look at these patterns here where our chaparral trickles out just north of the Klamath Mountains, kind of up in the Umpqua Basin. This California chaparral is characterized by evergreen shrubs with thick sclerophyllous leaves. They're shaped by summer drought and mild wet winters, and fire is very common in these ecosystems. Klamath Mountains, again, like I said, define the northern range extension with our thickest pockets down here in the southeast corner of the range. So here's some pictures. I should have done that already, but here's some nice pictures of this is actually that same oak woodland that I showed earlier, just at a different zoom out. Here's some Montane chaparral, knobcone pine, beargrass. So other chaparral patterns. So this again, I guess this is my favorite chaparral shot. Here's that same blue oak woodland with that same peak I was talking about. But within this chaparral, you can see things like chamise, lemon ceanothus, toyon, which are common throughout the rest of California south. Here's some Montane conifer forest, or Montane chaparral forest, with Arctostaphylos nortensis and Arctostaphylos aspidula. These are rare manzanita species that grow. This is the Siskiyou Wilderness in the headwaters of the South Fork of the Smith River in this picture. And if we zoom in, I'll do a plug for one of my books, Field Guide to Manzanitas. You can see the restricted ranges of both of these species. Well, this is Mallory's manzanita, which is only around Whiskeytown, Iron Mountain area, I believe, and then the Klamath manzanita, which is up near Scott Summit and along Highway 3, and I think there's more of that to be discovered or at least documented, because it's subtle. It's a subtle one to find somewhere between Arctostaphylos patula and Arctostaphylos. Sorry, the ground dwelling one. I'm having a blank. Thank you, Navidensis. And here are the two that I mentioned earlier that are only in the Josephine ophiolite area of Del Norte County, and they creep up into Oregon on the into the Kalmiopsis region. So cool manzanitas and these chaparral patterns, this is in the high elevations of the Trinity Alps. They're often defined by Quercus vaccinifolia, which is the huckleberry oak, along with Arctostaphylos spatula. And here's a nice picture from the Red Buttes. This was, was this 2018? I was doing yellow cedar surveys, and the lightning struck the night. We actually came in from the Oregon side, and I was walking along the ridge, and I caught that inversion above the Klamath River looking south. This is Preston Peak out here in the distance. So this is from the Red Buttes. But my point is here with this picture, we've got Quercus chrysolepis as well. And it really interesting patterns you can see in these Montane chaparrals. All right, Serpentine. So this is that story of the accretionary events that I talked about a little bit about that define the geology. We have the largest serpentine outcrops in North America here on the Josephine ophiolite in the top left corner. We also have these ancient serpentines of the eastern Klamath, the Scott and Trinity Mountain, Mount Eddy area, 300 million year old serpentines versus 60 or 70 million year old serpentines. So the time of these things accreting onto the continent, it's younger on the western side of the range. Here are some of those patterns when you can be walking in what might seem like a dense, snowy conifer forest, and all of a sudden it opens up and it's like you're in the desert, right? Often decorated by Jeffrey pine, but in this case there's Port Orford cedar up here. This is in the Siskiyou Wilderness. So just really interesting stuff, and you can't talk about serpentines without mentioning Kalmiopsis leachiana as well. This is a picture that I love from John Sawyer from the High Divide area of Del Norte County. These diminutive, dwarfed Jeffrey pines decorating this young ultramafic landscape. This is from near Vulcan Lake in the Kalmiopsis. You can see rimmed with Darlingtonia. You've got western white pine, Port Orford cedar. Just what a spectacular place to visit, wander around. I mentioned this spot earlier. This is probably my favorite serpentine outcrop on the planet. This is in the high in the Siskiyous. Heavy metals, just so restrictive to many plants, but the plants that live there, they thrive in some. It doesn't look like they thrive, but they're thriving. And then here's that here's that older serpentine of the western Klamath. Here's Mount Shasta. The Pacific Crest Trail runs along this ridge from Scott Summit. But this is one of my favorite groves of foxtail pines on the planet, really ancient, big old trees, East Boulder Lake Basin. And a classic Jeffrey pine shot. I was doing some whitebark pine surveys in the Marble Mountains, and I spied with my binoculars a couple of whitebark pines right here and lucked into this beautiful serpentine ridgeline below Boulder Peak. This fen, too, lives in my dreams, where you find this Darlingtonia and the carex that are just slowing down the flow of that water and building these beautiful pools. A little oasis in the desert of the serpentine. And then in the older serpentines here of the eastern Klamath Mountains, look at the size of this Darlingtonia meadow. This is Mount Eddy up here. So this is just south of that in the Scott Mountains. So, dreamy landscapes. I think I walked in, somebody was talking about serpentine landscapes, and I feel like we were on the same wavelength about this. This is at about 7,000 feet in the Trinity Alps. Look at that stand of Darlingtonia. This is where my buddy Justin, who co-authored the book, goes in and does a frog study. He's going to do his 21st year of this frog study for Cascades frogs in this basin. So he gets to see that stand of Darlingtonia every year, probably 2 or 3 times actually. And it's not just the Darlingtonia that are fascinating carnivorous plants. We have horned butterwort scattered across the Klamath Mountains, not documented as much as it could be. I think there's more of it than we know. But these leaves trap the flies or whatever is buzzing around to supplement the nutrient poor soils in which they live. We have 2 sundews. We also have Drosera anglica. There's only 1 location known in the Klamath Mountains that occurs, but the roundleaf sundew is a little bit more common across the Klamath. And an endemic lily, the Bolanders lily from that high divide, low divide, the Josephine ophiolite area, Northwest California, Southwest Oregon. It's a great picture. I got Christy Mergenthaler's permission to use in the book, the Walder rock cress. Same area there. And then if we zoom in just a little bit, Siskiyou lewisia. One of the, it's fascinating. A buddy of mine runs a greenhouse on the East Coast. He taught me this plant because he sells it. It's like this thing is a popular cultivar, right? And you can see why. It does well on serpentine, but it'll also do well off serpentine, which goes to show that the reason it's probably on the serpentine is it doesn't do well with competition. But if you put it in a pot and you ship them around and people make space for it in their yard or their garden, then it does pretty darn well. Say it again. Good drainage. That's true. Good drainage. A couple other rare plants. Julie wanted me to emphasize this. Julie Kierstead wanted me to emphasize this ultramaphix of Trinity County South. Things like serpentine milkweed. She's a stone crop lover. Here's the Tedock stone crop. It does have a rare plant rank. I need to change this. I think it's a CNPS 1B. I need to double check that, but it's pretty darn rare. This was the first, I climbed Preston Peak on Memorial Day in like 2005, and I found this thing popping up through the serpentine rocks on the summit to Preston. It just blew my mind that a plant could grow, little teeny thing could grow there. So this was, for me, this was my first, I guess, love of the serpentine was learning this plant. And, back then you had to do a lot more than just look it up on the internet. So it took me a while to figure out what I was seeing, go into the herbarium and using the Jepson manual. But anyway, that was good for me to discover this one for myself. And then I mentioned this earlier, but Siskiyou Kalmiopsis is the common name I'm giving it. If anyone knows there's another common name, I'd love to hear it, but Kalmiopsis leachiana. I was able to get into this Kalmiopsis in 2008, I believe, and see these in bloom. And this was just such a treat for me as well to get to, after the biscuit fire, to see that regrowth coming back to life within that huge, what is it, 200,000 acres. You hear about that. Now it seems like nothing, but back then that was a really big deal. And I thought, oh, it's not going. There's not going to be any alive, and there they were, just thriving after the fire. Well, this is the Montane conifers. This is where I really kind of fell in love with California in general, the West, I guess, more broadly, but getting up into that snow country, right, where the snow line is and where those conifers begin to thrive. And it obviously drove me to write a book and get my master's degree with conifer country. But let's take a little tour across the Montane conifer forest as well. So this is probably the most common vegetation type in the Klamath Mountains. This is white fir, Douglas fir. And this is at about 5,000 feet in the Siskiyou Wilderness. There's a little bit of an understory, well, maybe vine maple in there, so we're just transitioning out of the realm of the angiosperms and into the realm of the conifers. Yes. The Tedock, yes. Okay. Okay, I was pretty darn close. Thanks, Julie. All right. So, here's as you get a little bit higher above the Douglas fir, you get into the red fir forest. And I remember learning white fir and red fir in the Sierra Nevada, and they always sorted themselves out. You'd leave the white fir and you get into the red fir. In the Klamath Mountains, it's a little different. They often are mixed together, but these pure stands of these, particularly when you get into these pure stands of the Shasta red fir, I think this is where you really enter that subalpine wonderland that I call the Upper Montane conifer belt. As you move to the eastern part of the Klamath Mountains, this is in the Scots, there's very few firs and hemlocks, and the pines begin to dominate. And this is an almost pure stand and probably one of the most extensive stands I've ever seen of western white pine and lodgepole pine. Really a spectacular scene up there, and you can get a little bit above that and see foxtail pine and whitebark pine in what I call the Sky Islands, and that's our next vegetation community. But really spectacular. This is actually from the Corey Peak Botanical Area. And actually out in this, so this is the Gazelle-Callahan Road, and Etna, Scott Valley are just over here. And I would guess that's the Oregon border just in the distance there. So you can't talk about the Montane conifer forest without talking about the Russian wilderness. This is Russian Peak. Brewer spruce in this canyon. This is the Russian Creek here with Russian Peak above it. I'm going to be in here, I hope, in late June, working on the Bigfoot Trail with a crew. And well, what's so special about the Russian wilderness? Well, I think this is really the spot that has put conifers for me on the Klamath Mountains on the map, and it's the spot that Dale Thornburg and John Sawyer back in the late 60s and early 70s explored on a whim, sort of that Ledyard Stebbins sent a letter to John Sawyer, and he said, you know, I've heard there's possibly Engelmann spruce in this certain canyon. Can you go check it out? Sawyer and Thornburg went up there. They tromped around. They were enthralled. They went back the next summer and they tromped around some more. And they went to Sugar Lake, which is kind of covered. Whoa, goodness gracious. I did that wrong. I was trying to do the laser. Sorry about that. Got a little sneak peek. How did I do the laser? There it is. So Sugar Lake is here. It's covered by that 4, but they tromped up this ridgeline and dropped. No, they tromped up this ridgeline and dropped into Upper Duck Lake, and they found subalpine fir for the first time. They also found foxtail pine and whitebark pine. They got their maps out and they cooked up this idea of the Miracle Mile. There's 17 species of conifers, and then we heard from this guy, Richard Moore, who owns a gravel pit just right out here in Etna to the below. And he goes up Sugar Creek all the time. And he said, you know, I think there's an 18th conifer in the Miracle Mile. He hiked me up there one day, got off his front end loader, didn't even get a drink of water, beat me to the trailhead, hiked all the way up there without a water bottle, and showed me these. This is like 3 miles up in the canyon. Showed me the western juniper, and we got our 18th conifer in the Miracle Mile. So I think that's kind of fun to have 18 species of conifers in 1 square mile. So what about this Montane conifer forest also drives other diversity? Well, these heterotrophic plants I think are fascinating. It's a complicated world. There's a couple different ways to think about heterotrophic plants. Some obtain carbon directly from living things. Some have a parasitic relationship with a fungi. But the bottom line is we have a lot of these heterotrophic plants in the Klamath Mountains. I think most of us are familiar with snow plant, about woodland pine drops, California ground cones, purple broom rape. The story goes on and on. We may just have one of the highest diversities of any forest in North America of those heterotrophic plants. But you know, the other diversity comes from this Klamath Mountains being this crossroads. So if you look at this range map, we're at the southern range extension of Pacific silver fir, which is a Pacific Northwest specialist. We have endemics like the Brewer spruce that grow nowhere else. So all of these factors kind of come together to again drive this diversity of the Montane conifer forest. Here's a picture of the the Pacific silver fir forest up near high up in the near Monument Lake in the Marble Mountains. I first hiked here in 2004, and this stand of trees really was the driver for me to start writing conifer country. When I found the southern range extension of this Pacific Northwest specialist, I was like, wow, this place is cool. So I lucked into a gig where I got to map them. So here's Hancock Lake. Let me see here. I'm a little turned around. Monument Lake's here. English Lake. So all these little polygons are where we were able to find Pacific silver fir. You can see they prefer these north-facing slopes that have remained cool, wet, and fire-free over long periods of time. So this is one stand in California. And here's the other stand in California. Here's Cook and Green Pass. Here's the Oregon border. Here's Applegate Reservoir in the bottom right. Pacific Crest Trail in purple. But we have these other small stands. Actually, one's here, very small stand here, another one here, and another one here. This stand was mostly obliterated by the, I think, 2019 fire that rolled through that area. But the rest of those stands have more or less survived that. So this is, again, common in Oregon, way less common in California. It's probably California's rarest conifer. I'm not going to bore you with the numbers, actually. I think at this point we should move on. But there are a couple of things that are affecting them. I mentioned fire, bear. This is some bear scars. We have this fir engraver beetle. This is hitting a lot of the firs in the Klamath Mountains, and I think this is a complex story. The trees aren't necessarily dying. I think that there was a major response at the end of the Little Ice Age. A lot of branches, a lot of trees were produced, and there was fire suppression. And I think there's been a lot of dieback just because of the response to the drying environment and also the crowding of the trees. But unfortunately, we also have a few pathogens that are moving into the area, like the balsam woolly adelgid is now in Northwest California, Southwest Oregon, and along with some native pathogens like the western spruce budworm. So things to think about when you're walking through the forest or the forest pathogens. This is part of that stand of Pacific silver fir that was burnt up in 2019 in that upper Applegate region. So kind of sad to see that. That's probably not coming back. All right, Meadowlands. This is, the hills are alive here. This is the Marble Mountains. This was from 2011, our last big snow year. This was July 1st or 2nd. So massive amounts of snow, nice to see. It's going to be even more snowy up there this year. But the Meadowlands are driven in the Klamath Mountains. Most of the high percentage of these Meadowlands were glaciated. The end of the Pleistocene, the snow was removed. It was this novel habitat. Things began to pioneer it, particularly carex, which is a driver of the slowing down the water. And but these fens, these peatlands, they form in a variety of ways. And I won't go into the details here, but this is a sidebar in our book. But I think what's interesting is temperate mountain ranges. Peatlands are generally rare. And they have low mineral soil deposition, they have slow erosion rates, and they really store carbon well. So they're important places. And they're new. When you go see these in the Klamath Mountains, they're only 10 or 12,000 years old, which is kind of fascinating. Here's this is in the Trinity Alps on the edge of some serpentines. This meadow mixes with western white pine at the upper elevations here near Red Meadows, Stonewall Pass, Stony Ridge. This is Frog Pond in the Red Buttes. Things like mountain pond lily mixed with the carex. Here's a peatland in the Siskiyou Wilderness that I found when I was mapping. This is all Alaska yellow cedar, Calotropsis nucitensis. But look at the size of this little pond, decorated with this, bog asphodel. It's right there on the page. So really fascinating, these peatlands. And then here's like a zoom in on this carex. I think it's Carex integra that rim these peatlands and slow that water down. As you move north from here, sphagnum builds peatlands, but because we're sort of closer to the subtropics and more temperate, not into the boreal forest, we have peatlands that are built by carex or sedges. And they form these peatlands in old lakes, right? So a lot of meadows were lakes at one point, and now they're slowly filling in. But this is a real complex peatland in the Trinity Alps with Darlingtonia rimming the upper edges of it. And this is one of our few sphagnum peatlands. Buddy Jay, we only did that once. But what a fascinating spot that is. This is actually the same spot that the Drosera anglica, the English sundew, the carnivorous, the only documented spot. Look at all this bog bean too. Really fun to find the bog bean. Now meadows are, again, not everything's well with meadows. This is also a sidebar in our book. This is in the Marble Mountains, sky high in Paradise Lakes. You can see in just 60, 70 years, the encroachment of conifers into the meadows is happening probably because of fire suppression. There's also a lot of cattle that get run into these meadows, which is just an atrocity in my opinion. We need to back these cattle out of here, bring the elk back, sure, but we don't need cattle sitting in here and eating everything they can. Anyway, don't get me started on that. But so we need to start helping out these meadows. There's much that needs to be done. All right, I'm going to end with 2 more vegetation communities. The Sky Islands. This is when you get to the highest peaks, and we don't have a lot of super high peaks. The highest mountains in the Klamath Mountains are just over 9,000 feet at Mount Eddy and Thompson Peak. But the scene in the front center at the top is from Mount Eddy looking north into the valley of Wairika. Right below it, this is the Trinity Alps. So this is kind of our classic Sierra granite scene. Polemonium ediense on the bottom left. Foxtail pine, which is my favorite conifer. And here's a connectus from, I believe, that's actually in the Illaboli, Middle Eel Wilderness up near one of the high summits, Mount Lynn, I believe. In the Siskiyous, we have a couple of sky islands. This is Preston Peak, which is in the Siskiyou Wilderness. I think I'd consider Mount Ashland a sky island as well, but really fascinating to see Preston Peak so close to the ocean and the influence of that ocean, but also still harbors western hemlock, which is pretty rare, and also big stands of yellow cedar, Calotropsis nucadensis, and noble fir as well. This is Box Camp Mountain in the Marble Mountains. This is at 7,200 feet. It's kind of this real relic population of both foxtail pine and whitebark pine. They're not doing so well. There's not many of them left up there, but they're hanging on, but there's no more up for them. They can't go any higher. This is Boulder Peak, highest point in the Marble Mountains there in the background. And I think what's really fascinating about our sky islands, and I showed this picture at a whitebark pine conference once, and nobody believed, everyone thought I had my orientation wrong. But the south-facing slopes, that's where our pines live, right? So these are foxtail pines, whitebark pines. North-facing slopes are the firs and hemlocks. And look at that dividing line of that competition. They're just kind of clashing on that point. But everybody that's familiar with whitebark pine in the Rocky Mountains, they grow wherever they want on the north slopes. But we have this ticked up level of competition in the Klamath Mountains because they're lower elevation, but also because of the high levels of biodiversity. That's on South China Mountain. And this is a picture, I showed it to you earlier, but a picture from near the summit of Mount Eddy. Most everything you see above this lake on all the slopes, both big and small, are whitebark pine. There's like one small little pocket of foxtail pine out there, but this is probably our largest and purest stand of whitebark pine in the Klamath Mountains. Fascinating, getting up high in the Trinity Alps. It's not easy to navigate. This is up above Papoose Lake, but stands on the south-facing slopes again of whitebark and foxtail pine. Here's some mountain bog gentian from Mount Eddy. Here's the Mount Eddy Sky Pilot from my friend, a picture from my friend Kirsten Wayman. Wingseed draba. I fell in love with this plant last summer. I was up on the Marble Rim, and it was difficult to walk anywhere without stepping on it. There was so much of it. I had never seen so much in bloom. Really but look at how limited in distribution this thing is. Little mustard. This is a newer described species, I think from 2017 or 2018. Right from Stonewall Pass is the only place. I think there's a few other places but very rare plant named after John Sawyer. Sawyer's pussy toes, the Entenaria sawyeri. And I just want to mention and thank John. He was a friend and mentor of mine. Throughout the process of writing Conifer Country, he taught me many of the things I know today about the Klamath Mountains. And I've got to give him a a foxtail pine glory shot from East Boulder Lake here. All right, I'm going to end with juniper woodlands, and so in the far eastern Klamath, so Wairika, here's Mount Shasta, and obviously you all live right here in the Rogue Valley, but in the very eastern edge of the Klamath, we have the influence from the Great Basin. Here's some images from that influence, often I think defined in this case by western juniper, but there's some cool rare plants that grow out here, including Scott Valley Phacelia, Siskiyou Mariposa lily, Wairika phlox. kind of all that on that same pocket of the Greenhorn Mountains, just east of Wairika. So I'm sorry, west of Wairika. Let's all remember the Klamath Mountains are a gift, right? This is a place that we get to enjoy, we get to share with the people we love. I hope that you all can find a story or two or three that you'd like to share with others that you know. Share your love of the Klamath Mountains, get people out there caring for it, being better stewards, maybe getting cows out of the meadows, whatever you can help with. And I'm going to end with that. So thank you all for coming tonight. Sure, if there's any questions, yeah. Sure. Yep. People are zooming in from Costa Rica, people. Yes, question. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good. Okay, so how are warming climates and drying climates affecting plant communities? There's so many different answers, right? You know, and I'll start with foxtail pines, my favorite conifer. They're loving it right now, right? They are reproducing like gangbusters. There's all this new habitat on south-facing slopes where snow used to sit. They're growing. They're 40, 50-year-old trees everywhere. Is that going to continue? I don't know. Foxtail pines are not reproducing in the Sierra Nevada right now. There's zero instances right now of any sort of reproduction. So it's kind of like you just never know what you're going to get. And so that's one instance. You know, obviously things are not, white bark pine are not necessarily doing well. And I'm speaking to things that I know, you know, a little bit more about. But the stories are vast and wide, and we touch on in our futures chapter, we touch on some of that as well. But there's a lot to the story, I think, is the best answer. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, good question. I mean, I think I think we need to do some fuel treatments. I think there's a lot of red tape that needs to be jumped to make things like that happen. We need to be removing some of these conifers from the meadows. So Dalton said, what can we do to kind of help facilitate the restoring of these meadow systems? You know, I think we need to get the cows out. I can't say it enough. There's no reason that, you know, the same four families that are colonizers for 100 years are running cows and destroying our meadows for, you know, $10 of grass-fed beef or whatever. Like, that just needs to end. There's no reason that should happen. It needs to be returned to the elk and the wolves and whatever else. You know, we need to take a step back. I think the other things that we need to consider, my co-author Justin Garwood is doing remarkable work right now mapping the meadows of the Klamath Mountains. And what they're doing is they're actually removing all these invasive trout from lakes, not all lakes. Okay, I know some people like to fish and I kind of get it, but they're not supposed to be there, and they're killing Cascades frogs. Let's get them out of the stinking lakes. They don't need to be in every lake. People are like taking them from one lake and moving them up to the next lake so they can catch their next 12-inch fish the next summer. Like, let's not do it. Like, let's get them out of there. And I'm on a little bit of a soapbox here, but we need to not worry about ourselves, I think, is the point, and worry about the diversity and maintaining that diversity. So they've got the green light to take the invasive trout that have been planted for 80 years out of a select number of lakes, because they've proven that when you take those fish out, diversity returns. Like the response that they've had at a couple of lakes in the Trinity Alps when the fish have been removed, it's like 6 or 8 different reptiles and amphibians have responded and moved right back in within a year or two. So just small things like that, I think can make a huge difference. So, yeah. Okay. Yes, well, I think there's a lot of different resources. The first is to just go there and see what you can find. Maybe put it on iNaturalist if you don't know what it is. Cal Flora at least has a great, and I think Oregon Flora has this feature where you can zoom in on a place and click what grows there, and it'll give you kind of a little flora list of that area. And I say Cal Flora because these juniper woodlands are mostly within the California area of the Klamath Mountains. But there's plenty of juniper woodlands in southern Oregon, just probably outside of the Klamath Mountains. So yeah, a lot of different resources to do that. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the point is that you know Justin's going to tell more of this story in the future after they've got more than 2 lakes that they've worked on. But we're gonna be able to see how important work, restoration work, stewardship work is at a small scale within the Klamath. So anyway, I think that's probably a good point to stop. I really appreciate everybody coming out and listening to the story, and I'm going to hang out for a little bit and chat. So, and thanks for zooming in.